Hello, my friends. Thank you for choosing to pause and listen with Sleepy Zen tonight. Among so many sounds and endless choices, the simple fact that you are here at this moment is already an act of kindness toward yourself. Tonight, we will move very slowly through gentle Buddhist stories. Stories meant for restful sleep and for those quiet, lonely moments when the person you love is no longer by your side. There are nights when the emptiness doesn't come only from someone leaving, but from the familiar world inside us suddenly changing before we've learned how to stay with that change. When what once felt certain no longer feels the same, loneliness can settle in quietly without asking permission. The stories tonight are not meant to fill that empty space. They simply sit beside it, so you don't have to face it alone. Before we begin, if it feels comfortable for you, you're welcome to share in the comments what time it is, where you are right now, and then gently allow your breathing to slow down. I'm here with you. Emily couldn't remember exactly when the pillow beside her began to feel cold. It wasn't the first night after the person she loved left, but a few nights later when her body finally stopped waiting for a familiar movement. Before, every night after turning off the light, she would naturally roll to one side, as if her body had memorized the place where another breath belonged. Some nights, before sleep even arrived, she could hear that steady breathing beside her, soft and deep, like a small wave reaching the shore. Now, the room was the same. The bedside lamp still glowed, the clock still ticked, but the empty space beside her was different. So quiet that it felt as if the room itself had grown wider. She pulled the blanket closer, placed her hand on the empty pillow, then pulled it back as though touching cold air. Not the cold of weather, but a formless cold with no clear cause, simply absence. Emily didn't cry right away. She lay there with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence spreading through the room. At night, when there are no conversations and no casual questions, silence has its own sound, very soft, but long enough to remind you that you are alone. Some habits don't disappear when a person leaves. Emily still turned her head to the right when she woke in the middle of the night, still left space on the bed as if someone might return late, still kept the night light at a level meant for two, even though she was alone now. These small things didn't stab sharply. They simply weighed her heart down, like still water briefly stirred, then settling again. One evening, Emily sat up, folded the blanket on the other side, and placed the pillow neatly. She didn't know if she was preparing it for someone or just trying to make the room feel familiar. When she lay back down, the empty space was still there, but this time she didn't hurry to press herself to the edge of the bed. She lay in the center, letting her body touch both sides as if gently learning a new balance. Emily once heard someone say that loneliness is simply not having anyone beside you. But during these nights, she realized it came not only from someone's absence, but from her mind still holding on to an old picture. A picture with two people, two pillows, two breaths. The outside world had changed, but inside her, everything was still paused at the moment before goodbye. She placed a hand on her chest and felt her heartbeat, slow and steady. There was no one else here, but her body was still breathing, still alive, still resting in a safe room. That thought didn't make her feel better right away, but it allowed her to soften. Emily didn't need to fill the empty space tonight. She only needed to admit it was there, like a wave that had just reached the shore. Outside the window, the wind moved gently through the trees, and moonlight laid a thin line across the floor. Emily pulled the blanket a little higher, not to hide the emptiness, but to keep herself warm. The pillow beside her was still cold, but her heart no longer tightened as it had before. She allowed loneliness to stay, without pushing it away, without naming it, without trying to understand it, simply lying still, letting the night continue, letting her body slowly remember how to rest, even alone. Emily closed her eyes, not to force sleep, but to stop looking at the empty space. When her eyes closed, old images didn't rush in as strongly as she had feared. They appeared softly, like distant lights, no longer demanding to be held or pushed away. Her breathing slowed, deepened slightly, as if her body were finding its own rhythm again. There was a very small moment when Emily realized she was no longer listening to the silence for signs of someone else. She was simply listening to the room itself. The wind outside, the blanket brushing against her skin as she shifted. These sounds had always been there. She had just never noticed them. They didn't replace the breath that was gone, but they reminded her that this night was still unfolding. Slowly and steadily, she turned over, not out of old habit, but in the way her body wanted now. The pillow beside her remained empty and still, and she no longer reached for it. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling her breath rise and fall like a small wave finding its way back to shore. With each breath, her heart softened a little more, not because she had grown used to loss, but because she had stopped resisting what was present. Emily didn't tell herself that tomorrow would be better or that loneliness would disappear. She simply allowed herself to stay in this moment without fixing or adding anything. She understood that some nights would still be long and heavy, but there would also be nights like this one, where she could lie still and let her body do its work. The cold pillow beside her no longer felt like a painful reminder, but like a quiet sign of the truth unfolding. That one chapter had closed, and a new space had opened, even if she didn't yet know what would fill it. She didn't need to fill it now. She only needed to let it exist, wide and quiet, like the night sky that never rushes to cover its darkness. As sleep began to touch her, Emily felt her body grow heavier and softer. With no effort left in her breathing and no questions left to answer. Just one person resting in the night, safe, allowed to rest, allowed to be lonely in a gentle way. In that stillness, sleep arrived not as a solution, but as a natural continuation, soft enough to let her sink and let the night hold what remained. There are nights when loneliness doesn't come from lacking someone, but from the mind still holding the shape of a world that has already changed. We lie in a familiar room, on a familiar bed, yet keep space in our hearts for what no longer stays. And that quiet holding makes the emptiness feel colder, wider, harder to sleep through. Buddhism does not teach us to fill loneliness or to be strong against it. It gently reminds us that every feeling has the right to appear, even emptiness. And when loneliness is seen with kindness, it is no longer an enemy to push away, but a wave that comes because love once lived there and leaves when it is no longer held. When we stop trying to make everything return to the way it was, space begins to change. No longer a lack to hide, but room to breathe, to rest, to let the mind settle. Impermanence does not take love away. It only changes how love appears. And though some people leave our reach, the gentleness they leave behind continues in how we breathe, how we soften, how we learn to stay with ourselves. Tonight, you don't need to do anything with your loneliness. No fixing, no understanding, no naming. Just allow it to lie beside you, like the cold pillow on the other side of the bed. And when it is no longer resisted, loneliness naturally loses its sharp edges. And in that small permission, sleep may arrive, not to erase loss, but to remind you that even alone, you are still being held by this night, very gently. Grandpa Ellis had a habit of walking to the lake every afternoon, just as the sun pulled its harsher light away from the water. The narrow path leading there was as quiet as it had been for years, the small stones resting under his slow, careful steps. In his hands, he carried 2 ceramic cups, one worn and familiar, the other lighter, as if it had been used less. He was never in a hurry, Each step had its own pause, as though time itself were walking beside him, unpressured. The wooden chairs by the lake were still there, slightly faded from years of sun and rain. Grandpa Ellis set the 2 cups on the low table, then sat in the chair on the left, just as he always had. The chair on the right, closer to the water, remained empty. He looked at it for a moment, not in surprise, but because something very soft had brushed against his memory. And for a brief instant, he forgot that the person who once sat there no longer came. The lake lay still, reflecting a moon not yet fully round, and a light breeze carried the scent of damp grass. Grandpa Ellis lifted 1 cup, took a small sip, then slowly placed the other closer to the empty chair. A movement so natural, he only noticed after the cup had already settled. He paused, looking into the space where someone should have been sitting. A hand holding a cup, eyes resting on the water. There was no sharp pain, only a slight hollowing inside, like ground settling after a small shift. Grandpa Ellis exhaled slowly and did not pull the 2nd cup back right away. It stayed there between moonlight and cool air, a trace of an old habit that had not yet faded. He remembered the afternoons they had spent here, speaking very little, mostly sitting in silence. 2 chairs, side by side, 2 gazes turned toward the lake. Days when presence alone was enough to make the afternoon feel complete. Now the silence remained, but its shape had changed. Looking around, Grandpa Ellis noticed the lake was the same, ripples forming when the wind touched the surface, the moon hanging quietly above, asking nothing, waiting for nothing. Only the empty chair was new. He rested his hands on his knees, feeling the cool wood through the thin fabric, aware that his body was still here, still sitting in the right place, still breathing. A bird skimmed across the water, leaving a small trail of ripples, and Grandpa Ellis followed them with his eyes until they disappeared. He did not turn back to the empty chair again. He let his gaze drift across the lake, allowing memory to stay behind him, neither called forward nor pushed away. The 2nd cup was still warm, a thin steam rising and dissolving into the air. And Grandpa Ellis realized he was not sad in the heavy way he once imagined. If sorrow was there, it lay quietly, much like the lake before him, not taking his breath away, only reminding him that someone had once been here, and that it had been real. He lifted the 2nd cup, not to drink, but to feel its familiar weight, then set it back on the table, closer to his own. The 2 cups no longer faced 2 chairs, but rested side by side, like two small marks in a long afternoon. Grandpa Ellis sat a while longer, not waiting for anything, not trying to fill the empty chair, simply allowing the afternoon to continue and the absence to be present, gentle as the moon rising higher. He stayed until the moon climbed further and the lake turned a pale silver, the air growing cooler with the familiar chill of evening. And he pulled his jacket closer, not from the cold, but as a small, instinctive act of care. The empty chair remained, unchanged, not filled, not erased, quietly part of the scene. When he finally stood, he gathered both cups, pausing for a very brief moment as he lifted the second, then carried it with him as he had all the way to the lake. The path home was silent, the stones underfoot unmoved, the moon following him for a while before slipping behind the trees. And Grandpa Ellis did not look back, not because he did not remember, but because he did not need to know the empty chair was still there. At home, he washed both cups and placed them side by side on the shelf, without making any decision, simply letting things find their place. He turned off the light earlier than usual and lay down, allowing the tiredness of the day to spread through his body. And in the dark, the image of the empty chair passed through his mind and faded, without clinging or asking. His breathing grew steady and deep. There was no one beside him, but there was no feeling of being left behind. Only one person continuing on with life, carrying memory the way one carries moonlight in an open palm, not gripping it, not letting it fall. Aunt May always brewed tea in the afternoon at a very fixed hour, when the sunlight had softened and the kitchen began to grow quiet. The habit had formed many years ago, back when two people still sat together at the small wooden table by the window. She didn't need to check the clock. Her body simply knew when to boil the water, when to reach for the familiar teapot on the shelf. This afternoon was no different. Aunt May placed the kettle on the stove, opened the tea tin, and took in the faint scent of dried leaves. Her hands moved slowly and precisely, without hesitation. When the water reached the right temperature, she poured it into the pot, closed the lid, and let it steep for the same number of minutes as always. Then she took out 2 cups and placed them side by side on the table, spaced just far enough apart that 2 hands would not touch. Only after the tea had been poured did Aunt May pause. She looked at the second cup, filled to the same level as the one in front of her. There was no one sitting across from her, no sound of a chair being pulled back, no familiar question about the tea's aroma. The kitchen remained still, with only a thin steam rising from the 2 hot cups. Aunt May did not sigh, and she did not rush to put the second cup away. She simply stood there long enough to see what was happening. This was not the first time she had brewed an extra cup, and she knew it wasn't because she had forgotten, but because old habits were still there, moving on their own, as naturally as if time had never changed the shape of this home. She sat down, facing the unused cup, as afternoon light slanted through the window and highlighted the worn grain of the wooden table. Aunt May took a small sip. The tea tasted the same as always, neither weaker nor stronger. Everything was still right, except for one thing that no longer appeared. She remembered past afternoons when 2 people sat across from each other, each with a cup of tea, speaking very little, sometimes a short comment, sometimes just a nod, yet the presence of the other made the kitchen feel heavier, as if the space were filled with something invisible but real. Now, the second cup slowly cooled, and Aunt May lightly touched its rim, feeling the warmth fade. There was no sharp pain, only a steady, gentle emptiness, and she understood that loss does not always arrive as tears or collapse. Sometimes it is simply a habit continuing in a setting that has already changed. Aunt May did not blame herself for making extra tea, and she did not force herself to change right away. She stayed seated, letting both cups remain where they were, letting the afternoon pass at its own pace. Outside, birds called briefly, then fell silent. Inside, the clock ticked evenly, neither faster nor slower. After a while, Aunt May stood, picked up the second cup, poured the tea out, washed and dried the cup, and returned it to the shelf. The movement carried no strong emotion. It was simply a quiet rearranging, gentle and necessary. When she returned to the table, only 1 cup remained, cooling slowly in front of her. She sat again, not trying to fill the space across from her, just finishing her tea and allowing the kitchen to learn how to hold 1 person instead of 2. As the afternoon light deepened toward evening, Aunt May stayed until the light outside withdrew completely from the tabletop, the kitchen darkening in the familiar way it always had, regardless of who stayed or left. She stood, turned on the lamp, and warm light spread evenly through the room. Not warmer, not colder, just clearer. She cleared the table, placed the remaining cup in the sink, rinsed and dried it, and returned it to its place. Everything settled back into order, and as she turned away, she noticed she no longer looked toward the empty chair. not because she had forgotten, but because she no longer needed to look to confirm the absence. It had become part of the house, like a wall where a picture no longer hangs. Aunt May placed the teapot back on the shelf, closed the kitchen door, and walked slowly down the hallway. Her footsteps steady and unhurried. In the living room, she paused and looked around. Familiar objects remained where they were, unmoved and unchanged, holding no one, pushing no one away, simply present and steady. When night fully arrived, Aunt May sat down and let her shoulders relax, realizing that the afternoon had passed without her needing to do anything special to face the loss. No naming, no retelling, no telling herself whether she was okay or not, only living the afternoon with what was present. Before bed, she returned to the kitchen, washed the teapot, dried it one last time, and set it neatly back on the shelf. Tomorrow, she might still brew tea at that hour. Maybe 1 cup, maybe 2 out of habit, and she didn't feel the need to decide now. Time would adjust on its own, as it always does, slowly and without asking. Aunt May turned off the lights and let the house sink into quiet, with no spreading sense of emptiness, only a quiet acceptance that something had changed, and that she was learning to live with that change, without resistance or hurry. Loss rarely appears in grand moments. It shows up in small leftover habits, in an extra cup of tea, an empty chair, an action done exactly as before in a world that has shifted. Buddhism does not see this as weakness, only as the mind needing time to catch up with reality. When we unconsciously repeat what once belonged to 2 people, it is not because we refuse to accept the absence, but because love stayed long enough to become part of the body, part of the rhythm of life. Love does not disappear when someone leaves. It simply has not yet found a new form. Aunt May did not blame herself for the 2nd cup, and she did not force change. And in that calm, she allowed loss to pass through without turning it into an inner struggle. What Buddhism calls not adding suffering to suffering, neither pushing sorrow away nor clinging to it. When we notice old habits and bring gentleness into the present moment, the empty space no longer needs fixing. It becomes room for natural adjustment. And within that space, we learn how to continue living, not by forgetting, but by allowing life to slowly change its shape in a deeply human rhythm. Noah arrived at the riverbank while it was still dark. A time he had known for a long while, from days when two people stood here together, preparing fishing rods, bait boxes, and a small thermos of coffee. Morning always brightened in its own rhythm, never depending on how many people waited by the water. And Noah knew that. Yet his body still held the habit of coming early, as if the day itself needed time to open slowly. He set the rod into the ground, checked the line, and looked out over the river, where the water moved gently, reflecting a pale gray light, with no strong wind, only small ripples spreading and disappearing. Before, at this hour, there had been a familiar voice beside him, quiet and unhurried, just enough to soften the silence. And now that silence had returned whole, uninterrupted. Noah didn't feel abandoned, but he noticed the riverbank felt wider than before. The space between sky and water stretched open, revealing a gap he had never quite seen when two people stood side by side. Because back then, it had been filled so naturally. He poured coffee into the lid of the thermos and took a small sip. The taste was the same, but drinking alone felt different. With no one to share a brief comment, no soft laugh when the air felt colder than expected. Details that once seemed small but had quietly given shape to the morning. Noah placed the rod by the bank and let the line fall into the water, his movements slow and precise from repetition, not trying to fill the silence with thought, just standing there and allowing the morning to unfold on its own. As the light shifted from gray to pale blue, then to a thin line of gold along the horizon. For a moment, he remembered past mornings when they watched the sunrise together, speaking very little, simply knowing someone else was looking in the same direction. And he realized what he was facing now was not only the absence of a person, but the need to learn how to stand alone in moments that once belonged to two. The feeling was not heavy sadness, but a clear, open emptiness with no blur to it, as he stood exposed in the wide space, with nothing to distract him and nothing to shield him, while the sunrise continued without slowing down. The river brightening as the water caught new light. Noah adjusted his stance, grounding his feet more firmly on the bank, aware that his body was still here, still steady, that no one stood beside him, yet nothing was collapsing, only a morning opening in a way different from what he had known. He saw that being alone did not mean being left behind, but simply another form of presence, one that asked him to notice where he stood, what he was looking at, how he was breathing, not making the morning poorer, only more honest. The rod trembled slightly, and Noah looked down without hurry, unsure whether he was waiting for a fish or simply allowing time to pass. As dawn fully arrived, and the riverbank remained wide, though he no longer felt lost within it. He stayed there a while longer, the light now clear enough to show every small movement on the water, lifting the rod to check the bait and lowering it again, not out of expectation, but because it belonged to this morning, the familiar actions helping him stay with the present rather than drifting ahead. A few people appeared on the opposite bank, each keeping their own distance. No greetings exchanged, no disturbance to the quiet, and Noah realized the world continued moving in its ordinary way, even as a familiar part of his life had changed. A realization that did not make him feel smaller, only more aware that he stood within something larger than he had once imagined. He took another sip of coffee, slower this time, the warmth spreading clearly through his chest, and he did not try to recreate the feeling of before, allowing this morning to be its own, without comparison or measurement, simply noticing it. When the sun climbed higher, he gathered his things, with no particular catch and no sense of loss, turning away from the riverbank after one last look at the water now fully lit. The wide space still there, but no longer making him feel alone within it. On the walk home, Noah understood that some moments once shared must be learned again in a new way, not to replace the one who had gone, but to keep living fully in what is here. His steps even and unhurried, the morning having completed its work. There are forms of loneliness that do not come from being abandoned, but from standing alone in spaces that once held two people. And Buddhism sees this clearly. Suffering lies not only in loss, but in clinging to the old shape of happiness. When Noah faced the wider riverbank, nothing was taken from him. Only a familiar covering was gone, and that open space was not a punishment, but an invitation to see himself more directly, without relying on another's presence to feel whole. Being alone does not separate us from life. It is simply another way of being present, one that brings us back to our own breath, our place, our stance in the world. And when there is no one to share the moment with, the moment does not lose its value. It only becomes more private. Buddhism does not ask us to love loneliness, only reminds us that when we stop resisting it, loneliness is no longer a hole, but a neutral space where we can learn to befriend ourselves. And when that happens, the world no longer feels too wide or too tight, only wide enough to keep walking calmly into the light of a new morning. Sophie arrived at her classroom earlier than usual on Monday morning. The hallway still quiet, her footsteps sounding clearer in the empty space. And as she unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and stood for a moment looking at the neat rows of desks. Everything appeared exactly as it had the week before, yet she knew something had changed, even though no one had said it out loud. She set her bag down on the teacher's desk, hung her coat, and began arranging a few notebooks, letting the familiar morning routine steady her. And at the first desk by the window, her eyes paused a little longer on a small, empty space. The seat of a student who had transferred over the weekend. A very ordinary change in school life. Yet this morning, the absence stood out more clearly than she expected. When the bell rang, students streamed in, their voices quickly filling the room. And Sophie greeted each child with a gentle nod as the classroom settled into the right kind of noise. Lively, but contained, though once everyone was seated, she noticed a thin layer of silence still lingering in one corner. She began the lesson as usual. The material flowed. Questions were asked and answered, everything moving along as it should. Yet in small moments, she found herself waiting for a familiar hand to rise, for a certain look or short answer she had heard many times before. Moments that passed quickly, but were enough to remind her that a very specific presence was missing. That student used to arrive early, set their bag on the chair, and stand quietly waiting for Sophie to open the door. And each morning they would hold onto her hand for a brief moment, without saying anything, just standing there before heading inside. A habit Sophie never questioned, only knowing that the small hand would let go quickly, just enough to begin the school day. Now the morning continued as usual. Sophie teaching, writing on the board, moving between the rows. No one in the class appearing unsettled, because children adapt quickly and accept change with a natural ease, while adults often need more time to adjust to small, empty spaces. During recess, Sophie stood alone in the classroom and looked toward the seat by the window. Sunlight falling across the desk and highlighting the worn wood. With no backpack, no jacket draped over the chair, just a desk like any other, carrying a story that had ended quietly. She didn't feel a heavy sadness, only a gentle emptiness that didn't demand attention, realizing she wasn't only missing a student, but also the role she had played in that brief connection. A small trust, a short closeness, yet enough to leave a trace. When the dismissal bell rang and the students left, Sophie gathered her things, turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood in the quiet hallway for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge that the classroom continued, even as quiet departures occurred. And within that continuation, she began to understand that forming bonds and then parting was not a mistake, but a very real part of the work she had chosen. That afternoon, she stayed late to grade papers as the slanting light stretched the shadows of desks across the floor, moving slowly between rows to collect stray sheets, pausing briefly at the desk by the window to rest her hand on its surface before continuing, as if nothing more needed to be resolved. In the teacher's room, Sophie made a cup of tea, sat down, opened her notebook, and read old comments, noticing names that hadn't appeared in her classroom for years, each one recalling a very specific season. And she realized that teaching is always made of short meetings. People arriving, people leaving, while the classroom moves on through time. The next day, she rearranged the seating plan, not to replace anyone, but to give the room a rhythm that fit the present. Another student moving to the window seat where the light still fell as it always had. The emptiness not disappearing, but simply changing shape. In the weeks that followed, Sophie no longer waited for the familiar hand to rise, listening instead to new voices and different answers, each student bringing their own tone as the class settled into its new order. The initial emptiness fading from view while its memory remained, not weighing her down, only making her more careful with each small bond. One morning, standing at the classroom door, Sophie realized she was no longer searching for what was gone, but seeing the faces in front of her as they were, which didn't erase the memory of the student who had left, only showed that her care was not limited to a single connection. She closed the classroom door after school and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a space that had changed but not diminished. Understanding that her work was never to keep students with her, but to walk alongside them for a while, long enough for them to continue on their own. Loneliness sometimes appears not because we lose someone, but because a brief connection touched us more deeply than we expected. And Buddhism sees these meetings clearly, reminding us that there is nothing wrong with feeling moved by a departure, because that movement means we were fully present while we were together. We often believe only long relationships deserve grief, yet even short paths carry their own weight. And when a student leaves a classroom, what remains is not just an empty chair, but the memory of trust once given. Buddhism does not teach us to close our hearts to avoid loss. It gently reminds us that we do not own anyone, nor are we diminished when someone continues on another path, because we walked together for a time, and that was enough. When Sophie rearranged the classroom, she did not erase the past, only allowed the present to take a new shape. And in that allowance, loneliness no longer felt like a painful gap, but a quiet reminder that every meeting has its own season. And when that season ends, what remains is not loss, but a soft gratitude, enough to keep the heart open for the next meeting to come. Brother Finn arrived in the kitchen earlier than usual that morning. Before the light had fully risen, the monastery, so quiet that his footsteps echoed clearly against the cool stone floor. He washed his hands, dried them, and began scooping rice into bowls, the familiar motion steady and automatic, requiring no thought at all. One bowl, then another, until the ladle paused midair, and he realized he had served one extra portion. He stood still for a moment, looking at the two bowls placed side by side on the long wooden table. Soft yellow light settling over the warm rice as a thin steam rose gently upward. There was no one standing beside him, no quiet morning conversation, no familiar greeting. The person who once sat across from him during early meals had left the monastery months ago. Yet Brother Finn's habit had remained. He did not rush to remove the extra bowl, nor did he feel embarrassed. He simply looked a little longer, long enough to understand that this was not a mistake, but a memory moving on its own, gentle and precise, as if his body still believed this morning would be like the ones before. Brother Finn carried both bowls into the dining hall, where the room was empty and the chairs neatly arranged. Sunlight from the high windows casting clear shapes of light and shadow across the floor. He sat alone, placing one bowl in front of him and the other directly across, the distance between them just wide enough for someone who used to sit there. He began to eat slowly, without hurry. The rice was still warm, the taste unchanged, but the atmosphere of the meal was different. Before, they often ate in silence, exchanging only an occasional short sentence, and that silence had once carried the shape of companionship. Now the silence remained, but it stood by itself. Brother Finn chewed carefully, aware of each small movement, not trying to fill the meal with thought or memory, though his gaze still drifted to the second bowl from time to time, not out of expectation, but because the habit of presence had not yet faded. He remembered those mornings when they sat together, speaking little, simply knowing another person was beginning the day in the same rhythm. And although the monastery itself had not changed, the schedule unchanged, the bell still ringing on time, he could feel how a part of the old rhythm still echoed in moments as small as serving rice. When he finished eating, he set his chopsticks down and looked again at the two bowls, one now partly empty, the other untouched, and he did not feel a heavy sadness, only a clear awareness that some things do not disappear when someone leaves. They continue quietly in familiar gestures. He stood, took the full bowl to the sink, and let the water run steadily, carrying away the last grains of rice, washing the bowl carefully, drying it, and returning it to the shelf with the others, without ceremony, without any large decision, simply letting the morning continue as it was. When Brother Finn returned to the dining hall, the table was empty, morning light spreading slowly across the floor, and he stood there briefly, inhaled, then exhaled, the extra bowl no longer present, though its trace remained in his awareness. Not uncomfortable, not demanding explanation, just part of a reality that had changed shape. He stepped outside into the courtyard. As the sun climbed higher, the air cool and carrying the scent of plants from the night before, and swept the ground as usual, each stroke of the broom slow and even, the familiar work settling his body into a steady rhythm, where thought did not need to interfere, dry leaves shifting and coming to rest in new places. He remembered how his old companion once stood in this same corner in the early mornings, just as silent, working alongside him without instruction, simply close enough to know another person was there. And though their parting had been calm farewells did not mean habits vanished all at once. After finishing, he put the broom away, washed his hands, and returned to his room, where two bowls still sat side by side on a small wooden shelf. Just as before, he glanced at them briefly and turned away, with no decision to keep or remove them, allowing them to remain neutral, free of demand. During chanting, Brother Finn sat in his usual place, his voice steady and even. And when the final verse ended, silence spread naturally, not lacking, only no longer shared in the old way, yet unchanged in its essence. Wide, stable, leaning nowhere. At midday, when the meal came again, Brother Finn served only one bowl of rice this time, not as a correction, but as a small adjustment that arrived on its own. And he ate without looking across the table, not because he was avoiding absence, but because he no longer needed to check for it. The day continued, filled with other tasks, and within that flow he understood that memory was not holding him back. It was simply walking alongside him, light as shade along a familiar path. There are memories that do not need to be erased for us to continue forward. And Buddhism sees memory like a scent, able to linger in the air without becoming a rope that binds us. When we neither cling nor push away, memory finds its own place, Brother Finn's extra bowl was not a sign of weakness, only proof that a connection had once been deep enough to leave its mark in the smallest gestures. And when that connection ends, habits may remain for a while, like a brief echo after sound has faded. Buddhism does not ask us to cut off memory to prove we have let go. Letting go is not forgetting, but allowing memory to be present without directing how we live today. And when Brother Finn washed the extra bowl and returned it to the shelf, he did not deny the past. He simply did not allow it to decide the rhythm of the present. If in your own life there are similar extra portions, an empty seat, a repeated habit, a sudden memory, you do not need to rush to fix them. Simply notice and continue living. And when memory is no longer gripped tightly, it becomes light, allowing us to move forward not with burden, but with a gentle understanding of how love once stayed. Grace stepped into the garden early in the morning, when dew still clung to the leaves, and the soil held the cool breath of the night. She carried her familiar woven basket with pruning shears, gloves, and a small notebook worn at the spine. The dirt path leading out was unchanged, each small stone resting exactly where it always had, as if nothing in her life had ever been disturbed. This garden had once been cared for by two people. There were no clear divisions of responsibility. Each morning, they simply came out together, each taking a corner, working in silence. One pulling weeds while the other trimmed dry leaves. One watering while the other checked the soil. There was no grand plan, only familiarity repeated day after day. Now, Grace worked alone. She knelt beside the basil bed, gently loosening the soil around the stems. The leaves were green and healthy, releasing a scent she knew well. She cut a few sprigs, placed them in the basket, and moved on. Everything in the garden continued to grow in its proper season. No plant stopped growing because one caretaker was gone. No flower delayed its bloom because of that absence. Grace saw this clearly. The garden did not grieve. It did not know loss. It only knew sunlight, water, soil, and time. Life continued in its own steady way, without asking permission. This truth made her pause longer than usual, not from pain, but from a clear realization that life does not wait long enough for us to decide whether it should continue. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, looking across the garden. There were corners she hadn't touched in days, not out of neglect, but because they had once belonged to the other person. She hadn't avoided them deliberately. She had simply not stepped in yet, leaving a familiar space unchanged. She walked toward a patch of daisies that had once been carefully tended. The flowers were still blooming, neither brighter nor faded, simply there. Grace bent down and pulled a few weeds, her movements slightly clumsier than usual. She did not scold herself. She only slowed down, letting her hands and eyes learn the work anew. As the sun rose higher, the garden brightened fully. Grace wiped her forehead, set the basket down, and rested on a stone step from where she could see the entire garden. It was no longer symmetrical. Some beds were more carefully tended, others still uneven. But overall, the garden was alive. There was no sign of collapse. Grace thought of the person who once stood beside her here, not with a surge of emotion, but with a simple acknowledgement. They were gone, and that did not erase what they had planted. The trees they set in the ground still grew. The seeds they scattered still sprouted. Their presence had not vanished. It simply no longer needed a body to continue. She stood again and returned to work, this time stepping into corners that had never been hers before. Her hands moved slowly, but with certainty. No one instructed her. The garden showed her what was needed. Where the soil was dry, where leaves had wilted, which branches needed cutting. Care did not require memory. It only required presence. Morning passed. The basket grew fuller. The garden was not perfect, but it was alive. Grace looked around once more, not searching for traces of the one who had died, and not trying to erase anything, simply noting that the garden still bloomed, even without the one who had tended it. And in that clear truth, she began to understand that continuing to live was not a betrayal of memory, but the most natural way memory was allowed to remain. She gathered her tools as the sun rose high enough to dry the dew from the leaves, washed her hands at the outdoor tap, and watched the soil rinse away, the cool water sharpening her awareness, as if the morning had completed its work. The garden behind her did not fall silent. It simply continued, living in its own rhythm, needing no further glance. In the days that followed, Grace returned regularly. Some days she worked longer. Some days she only walked through briefly. She did not aim for perfection. She allowed the garden to adjust alongside her. Some plants grew faster, others slowed. Season followed season, without needing agreement from anyone. One afternoon, Grace stopped beside a tree they had once planted together. She could no longer remember who dug the hole or who set the tree in place. Those details had faded, but the feeling of that afternoon remained, clear and quiet. She rested her hand on the trunk, feeling its steadiness. The tree did not need her to remember the past in order to keep standing. Grace realized she had stopped looking for the other person in every corner of the garden. Not because she had forgotten, but because she no longer needed to confirm the absence. The garden had taught her something very directly. Life does not need to stop in order to prove loyalty to memory. She carried the basket inside, laid the herbs on the table, and began sorting them. A task once done together, now done alone, without a sense of lack. Only difference, and that difference carried no judgment. As evening came, Grace sat by the window and watched the garden fade into darkness. She did not feel that she had moved on. She only knew that she had continued, and that the garden had continued with her, quietly. Impermanence is often misunderstood as something cold. But in Buddhism, impermanence does not destroy life. It allows life to go on. When someone leaves, it does not erase what has been planted. It only changes how those things continue to exist. Grace's garden did not deny loss. It simply did not stop because of it. And through that, she understood that continuing to live is not forgetting the one who is gone, nor betraying love, but allowing love to change its form. From two people standing together to life itself unfolding. We often fear that if we continue, memory will fade. But memory does not need stillness to survive. It lives in what has been created. A garden, a habit, a new rhythm slowly forming. Buddhism does not ask us to cling to the past to prove that we loved. It gently reminds us that true love does not block life. When we allow life to continue, memory does not disappear. It settles, becomes steadier, no longer needing protection. And in that steadiness, we move forward lightly, carrying what once was as a natural part of who we are. Jonas began making the picture frame on a light, rainy afternoon in the small woodshop behind his house, where the scent of pine and oak mixed with the damp air. After he had measured carefully and written every number on a folded piece of paper tucked into his jacket pocket. This frame was not for a client. It was made more slowly, with more care, as if every cut needed an extra moment of thought. He chose a light-colored wood with a quiet grain, nothing ornate, remembering clearly that the person he intended it for never liked anything too elaborate. And he sawed each piece, smoothed the edges, and test-fit the corners again and again before fixing them in place. His hands moving in a rhythm so familiar that his body knew what to do before thought could step in. The frame slowly took shape, clean corners, a smooth surface, and Jonas set it on the table, stepped back, and imagined the photograph inside it, hanging on the empty living room wall, a spot already chosen, everything having its place, waiting only for the right time. But that time never came. When Jonas returned to the workshop after days away, the frame was still there, lightly dusted, the note with measurements still in the pocket of the old jacket on the hook. No decision made. The frame never hung. The person meant to receive it gone before the work was finished. Jonas did not rush to put the frame away, nor did he hurry to complete the small, unfinished details. It remained there in the workshop like a task without a name. And each time he entered, his eyes passed over it, not lingering long, but long enough to know it was still there. Some mornings, he stood in front of it for a while, resting his hand on the wood, feeling its smoothness and weight, without sharp regret, only a clear sense of suspension, because this frame belonged neither fully to the past nor properly to the present. He considered taking it apart and using the wood for something else, but the thought faded quickly, not because he couldn't, but because he knew this frame already carried a different purpose, one that no longer needed completion, but also did not need erasing. Jonas brought the frame into the house and leaned it against the living room wall, which remained empty, without nails or signs of an abandoned plan. Just a light-colored wall wide enough for the frame to rest against without drawing attention. Days passed, and Jonas continued his work as usual, building cabinets, repairing tables, making new chairs, jobs with clear beginnings and endings, while the frame had neither, asking nothing of him, simply existing without demand. One evening, with the living room softly lit, Jonas sat and looked at the frame leaning against the wall, and realized he no longer thought about hanging it, not because he had given up, but because the intention itself had changed shape. The frame was no longer an ungiven gift, but an object that held the care placed into it. He stood, adjusted it so it leaned straight, did not add a photo, did not hang it, leaving it there as a pause between decisions, with nothing missing and nothing needing completion. Outside, night settled in, and in the quiet room, the wooden frame stood there, neither empty nor full, simply a trace of love shaped by hands, not needing to reach an endpoint to matter. Jonas left the frame there for many days, not because he forgot it, but because he no longer felt the need to resolve it. Watching morning light enter the room from different angles, sometimes highlighting the grain, sometimes leaving only a soft shadow on the wall. The frame neither obstructing life nor asking for attention, becoming part of the room like something that had found its place. At times, Jonas thought of placing any photograph inside it, not the one originally intended, just something simple to fill the space. But the thought passed quickly, because he saw that filling the frame would not make it more complete. It had been complete from the moment he placed his care into every cut and sanding. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, Jonas lifted the frame, wiped it gently, and set it back in the same spot. The movement, natural and without strong emotion. Seeing it not as something abandoned, but as something finished long ago that simply took a different path. Jonas understood that not everything needs to be completed to hold meaning, that some things are born from love, and that love itself is already the ending. The frame never hung was not a failure, only proof that life sometimes changes direction, and that what we make does not always need to arrive to be worthy. As night fell, Jonas sat again in the softly lit room, no longer imagining how the other person might have seen the frame, no longer thinking about what should have happened, while the frame stood quietly, without accusation or pain, simply present. We often believe that everything must be finished to have value. Yet Buddhism sees it differently. Value lies not in where something ends, but in the mind we place into it while making it. And when Jonas made the frame, he placed attention, patience, and genuine care into it, none of which was wasted. Loss can make us believe that what was never given has become meaningless. But what remains unfinished does not disappear. It only changes how it exists. And the frame not hung is not an emptiness, but a place to breathe, where love is allowed to stay without needing form. Buddhism does not ask us to close everything neatly. Sometimes closure arrives when we stop trying to complete. And when Jonas let the frame rest against the wall, he did not give up. He simply accepted that the original path had changed, and meaning did not need to follow the old route. If in your own life there are things that were never quite in time, words unsaid, gifts ungiven, plans unfinished, you do not need to rush to fill them. because the care you placed into them may already be enough. And in that enough, we learn to let what is unfinished exist, not as a flaw, but as a deeply human trace of love that once lived. The temple on the hillside was quieter on weekdays, and Master Linden knew this well, having lived here long enough to recognize the rhythm of people coming and going, of crowded festival seasons and open, spacious days. This morning, when he opened the wooden gate, the courtyard was completely still, with no early footsteps and no soft greetings. Only a light wind passing through the bamboo grove behind the temple, creating a thin, almost transparent sound. Master Linden swept the courtyard as he always did, the bamboo broom touching the ground in an even rhythm, neither fast nor slow. In the past, there were usually a few young monks sweeping at this hour, saying little, yet their presence gave the courtyard a different kind of vitality. Now, he swept alone. The courtyard was just as clean as ever, only wider. He paused in the middle of the yard, resting the broom on the ground and looking around. The stone steps leading up to the main hall were unchanged, the old roof tiles resting quietly under the morning sun. There was no sign that the temple lacked anything. Yet Master Linden sensed that the absence of people created a very particular kind of space, one that could not be filled by objects or sound. He stepped into the main hall and lit a stick of incense, watching the smoke rise slowly and disperse evenly into the air. Before, at this hour, there were often scattered chants, each voice following its own rhythm. Now, there was only him. Master Linden sat on the cushion, back straight, hands resting lightly on his thighs, and did not begin chanting right away, allowing the silence to fully arrive. Silence in an empty temple is different from the silence of late night or deep forest. It carries the depth of footsteps that once passed through, of prayers once spoken and dissolved. Master Linden felt this clearly. He did not feel sad, but he did not call this feeling peace either. It was simply reality plainly revealed. After a while, he began to chant, his voice low and steady, the sound spreading through the wide space and returning softly. No one joined in. No one listened in the usual sense. Still, Master Linden chanted each line completely, neither faster nor slower, knowing that the presence or absence of others did not change the meaning of the practice. When he finished, he remained seated for a moment longer, as light passed through a small window and settled on the wooden floor, dust floating slowly in the air. And he realized that this silence was not empty, but full of traces of life that had once been here. He stood and walked along the corridor behind the main hall, where small bells hanging under the eaves stirred gently in the breeze. No one paused to listen. No one pressed their palms together. Yet the sound arose, exactly when it should. Master Linden understood that the temple did not lose its meaning when fewer people came. Just as a person does not lose value when alone, absence simply reveals the true shape of space, of mind, of what does not depend on crowds to exist. He stopped on the front steps and looked down the path leading up to the temple. It was empty. No one was walking toward him. Master Linden did not wait, nor did he feel the need to fill the quiet with plans or thoughts. He simply stood there, letting the temple be a temple, letting silence be itself, without naming it, without trying to change it. After a while, he turned back inside and closed the gate, not to keep anyone out, but to complete the morning as he always did. Inside, the quiet remained unchanged, not hollow, just clearly spacious, unobscured by movement or noise. He went into the small room behind the hall and prepared tea, water boiling, pouring into the pot, steam rising slowly. And he sat alone drinking tea while looking out at the courtyard. No one passed by, yet the yard was not sad. It was simply empty in its natural way. And he recognized that there are times when emptiness needs no explanation, only permission. Midday arrived gently as the light shifted and sun reached deeper into the corridors. Master Linden walked around the temple, checking doors, wiping dust, adjusting small objects, the familiar tasks keeping him in rhythm with the place. Without hurry and without any intention of making the temple appear busier or more alive, because it was already living in its own way. A group of birds landed briefly on the roof tiles, called out, then flew off, the sound short and clear, leaving no echo. And Master Linden watched without smiling or frowning, simply noticing how life comes and goes without warning or permission. As evening approached, he sat again in the main hall, the light softer now as shadows entered the corners. He did not light additional lamps, allowing the light to adjust on its own. And in the deepening dimness, silence did not grow heavy, only deeper. He understood that many people fear emptiness because they mistake it for loss. But through years of living in the temple, he learned that emptiness takes nothing away. It simply does not add anything. And when nothing is added, what already exists becomes very clear. We often confuse emptiness with lack. Yet Buddhism clearly distinguishes the two. Lack is when we want to fill a space with something, while emptiness in its deeper sense is space allowed to exist without being occupied. Master Linden's quiet temple did not lose its spirit. It was simply no longer covered by sound and people. And in that silence, the true nature of the place was revealed, independent of how many were present. Loneliness is the same when we do not rush to fill it. It stops being frightening and becomes a neutral space where we can clearly see where we are, how we stand in this life, without comparison or addition. Buddhism does not encourage us to avoid emptiness in search of comfort. It gently reminds us that when we allow emptiness to exist, it does not make us poorer, but gives us back a necessary clarity. And within that clarity, we can be alone without being isolated, in silence without being abandoned, simply present fully within the space that is. Master Orek woke very early, before the first bell sounded through the monastery. He stepped into the courtyard and pulled the wooden door closed behind him, letting the hinge touch the frame softly before settling. The sky was still dark, the air cool and dry. He took a short breath, not deep, not long, and walked a few steps across the cold stone ground. His right hand curled into a fist by old habit, not from the cold and not from any clear tension, just a movement that had stayed with him for many years, ever since his time as a warrior. When standing still, the hand closed. When waiting, it closed. When he did not know what to do next, it still closed. Master Auric looked at his hand in the thin early light, the knuckles thick and strong, marks of years of force that had never fully faded. He did not rush to open it. He simply looked as one looks at an old habit still at work. He walked along the corridor and stopped by the stone well, where the water was clear and still. He bent down, scooped up a ladle of water, and washed his hands. As the water ran over them, the hand loosened slightly, not completely, just enough that the fingers no longer clenched. Long ago, Master Auric believed that gripping tightly was the only way not to be swept away. On the battlefield, letting go could mean death. hesitation could mean losing someone. Those lessons sank deep into the body and did not leave simply because circumstances had changed. When he entered the monastery, he brought with him the body of someone shaped by tension. Others carried luggage. He carried reflexes. And those reflexes often showed themselves in his hands. Master Auric took a broom and began sweeping the courtyard, each stroke steady as dry leaves shifted, gathered, and came to rest. As he swept, his hand held the broom handle firmly, not because it might slip, but because that was how his body had learned to work. After a few strokes, he noticed that if his grip softened just a little, the broom still moved as it should. The leaves still gathered, and nothing bad happened. He paused and switched hands. His left hand was less used to tightening, the movement slower but no less precise. And Master Auric noted this clearly, without praise or judgment, simply noticing. When the courtyard was clean, he returned the broom to its place, and his right hand closed briefly into the air again, as if searching for something to hold. He left it as it was, without correcting or blaming, only observing. During training, Master Auric stood facing a young novice and offered a very simple exercise. Clench the hand tightly, hold for a few breaths, then open it. The novice did as told, shaking his fingers slightly when he opened them, as if to release the numbness. Master Auric watched that moment carefully. "What do you notice?" he asked evenly. "My hand feels tired," the novice replied. Master Auric nodded, saying no more, knowing that the body understands before words, and that this lesson needed very few. As the morning passed, Master Auric returned to the courtyard, the light now different as sunlight touched the stone. He held both hands in front of him, closed them, then opened them again. This time, not as an exercise, but as a natural gesture, realizing that opening his hand did not make him weaker, only less tired. There are things we grip not because we need to, but because we are afraid. And the more fear there is, the tighter the grip becomes. Master Auric did not hurry to teach this. He let his own body learn first, trusting that when the hand learns to release, the rest will follow, slowly but surely. In the afternoon, he repaired a wooden door whose hinge had sagged, laying out his tools neatly on the stone floor. When he picked up the hammer, his hand tightened automatically, and he noticed it immediately, not stopping or forcing it to loosen, simply continuing and allowing the body to adjust when it sensed there was no need to grip so hard. The door was lifted, adjusted, tested a few times, everything moving smoothly. Master Aurek set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his robe, and when there was nothing left to hold, his hand briefly closed and opened again. A quick movement, almost unconscious, yet he saw it, and seeing was enough. At the end of the day, he passed by the training yard, empty now, a light wind lifting dust before it settled again. He stood for a moment, looking at his hands in the fading light. With no command given and no formal exercise, only the clear presence of a habit slowly losing its force. He remembered the years when letting go meant danger, but that time was gone. And the hardest part was not learning a new skill, but allowing the body to update its sense of safety. Master Aurek knew that this understanding does not come through thought alone. The body needs time to believe. Before night fully arrived, he stopped by the steps and rested both hands on the wooden railing. And this time his fingers did not tighten. They simply rested, with weight but without strain. Master Aurek exhaled a short breath, not deep, not long, just enough to mark a moment that was different. We often believe that gripping tightly is how we keep things from being lost. Yet Buddhism looks more deeply. The tighter we grip, the more the hand aches, and what we hold is not made safer by force. Often, what causes us pain is not loss itself, but prolonged tension in situations that no longer require it. Master Aurek did not teach release with words. He let his body become the example. And when the hand opened and nothing bad happened, trust began forming at a level deeper than thought. Letting go does not make us weak. It returns a flexibility we had forgotten. In daily life, we grip many things out of fear. Memories, roles, expectations, images of who we think we are, until we no longer notice how tired our hands have become. Buddhism does not ask us to drop everything at once. It simply suggests a very small experiment. Open the hand a little and see what happens. When we allow ourselves to loosen our grip, the world does not collapse. Often it becomes lighter, and in that lightness, we find space to breathe and continue forward. Not with fists clenched in fear, but with hands open enough to receive the life that is still unfolding. Nareen often walked along the river in the late afternoon, when the sunlight had softened and the surface of the water began to change color. The dirt path ran beside the current, uneven and winding, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, as if it had been shaped only to keep pace with the river rather than control its direction. Nareen walked slowly, not from fatigue, but because she was used to noticing the smallest changes in the landscape around her. This river had been here for a very long time, flowing past the village, across low fields, and through exposed stone. Nareen had heard many stories told along its banks. Some came to remember the past, some to complain about the present, some simply stood and watched the water move without speaking. She did not keep the stories. She listened and let them go, the way the river always did. That afternoon, someone stood at a familiar bend, staring down at the water for a long time, as if waiting for something to appear again. Nareen did not approach right away. She stayed at a distance, enough not to disturb the silence, knowing there are moments that do not need a second person. When the person turned, Nareen stepped closer. They greeted each other with a slight nod. No opening questions, no introductions. The presence of the river enough for both to understand why they were there. "I come here every day," the person said, without sadness or blame. "I keep thinking that if I stand here long enough, maybe everything will return to the way it was." Nareen looked down at the water as a leaf fell, drifted quickly, and disappeared around a bend. She picked up a small stone and dropped it into the river, the ripples spreading and then fading. "Water is still water," she said evenly, "but it does not stay in one place." The person did not answer, eyes still following the current, and Nareen said nothing more, knowing the river was doing its work better than any explanation. They walked along the bank together for a short while, without trying to match each other's pace. Sometimes the person walked ahead, sometimes Nareen slowed, because the path did not require harmony, only that each keep walking. Nareen stopped at a small sandy patch where the water moved more slowly and pointed to it. "Here," she said, "the water looks gentler, but if you stay long enough, you'll see that it still moves." The person watched, noticing how the surface reflected the fading light, and how, if one looked closely, the water continued its steady passage. Nareen recognized what many people miss. We do not suffer because the river changes course, but because we stand still and ask everything else to return to its old place. The river does not do that. It does not turn back. It does not apologize. It simply continues to flow. As the sun dipped behind the trees, they both stopped. No conclusions were made. No promises spoken. Yet the silence now felt different from before. Less tense. Noreen bent down, picked up another small stone, and placed it in the person's hand. Not to keep, she said, just to remember that the water passed through here. The person held the stone briefly, then dropped it into the river without watching, without waiting, and the current carried it away quickly, leaving no trace. Noreen turned and continued along the bank without looking back, not from coldness, but because she knew the river had already said enough. The rest did not need more words, only time and a small permission to allow the flow not to return to an old bend to prove it was still itself. She walked a little farther, then turned away from the river onto a higher path, where the whole stretch of water they had just walked alongside could be seen. The current appearing continuous and unbroken, as if the confusing bends disappeared when viewed from a distance. Noreen stopped, rested her hand on the worn wooden railing, and looked down. Below, the person still stood by the river, no longer staring intently, simply standing with relaxed hands, letting the water pass. Noreen did not need to know what the person was thinking. The river did not ask for complete understanding, only to be seen as it was. The evening breeze rippled the surface. Birds passed overhead, their shadows flickering on the water before vanishing. And Noreen turned and continued on her way, each step taking her farther from the bank, but not away from the current. The river remained, doing its work without needing witnesses. As the sky darkened, Noreen paused by a low stone step, removed her mud-marked shoes, brushed them clean, and looked toward the river one last time that day, with no sense of completion, only a clear continuation. Tomorrow, the water would still flow. People would come and go, and stories would keep moving on, without returning to old bends to prove anything. We often suffer because we want everything to return to how it was. Yet Buddhism looks at this directly. No current stands still waiting for us to be ready. And suffering does not come from life changing, but from demanding that it keep its old shape. The river in Noreen's story does not deny the past. Water that has passed is still water, but it does not stay in one place to be named And when we understand this, memory no longer needs to be tightly held, becoming part of the flow rather than separate from the present. Many believe that if we let things move on, love will be lost. But true love does not need to stand still to exist. It learns to move with life, as water moves through stone and sand, through narrow and wide places without losing its nature. Buddhism does not teach us to forget old bends in the river. It simply reminds us that we cannot remain there. And when we allow ourselves to keep walking, the current does not take away what mattered. It carries it into another form, lighter, deeper, and no longer trapping us at a point already past. KL often went out at night, when most of the town lights were off, and the sky revealed itself more clearly. He didn't bring a telescope or a star map. All he needed was a patch of darkness deep enough and time slow enough for his eyes to adjust. The dirt path leading up the hill was familiar, each step making only a faint sound, as if the ground itself did not want to disturb the night. KL stopped at the open clearing where the entire sky could be seen, laid his jacket down, stood still, and lifted his gaze upward. The stars did not appear all at once. They arrived gradually, one small point of light after another, until the sky no longer felt empty the way it had at first. KL knew this well. He had watched the sky long enough to understand that many things are already there, even when we cannot yet see them. Someone was with him tonight, standing a few steps away, arms folded, eyes lifted but not fully looking. "I can't see them anymore," the person said, voice steady, unbroken. "It's like they've completely disappeared." Kale did not answer right away. He bent down, picked up a small stone, turned it in his hand, then placed it gently in the other person's palm. "Hold this," he said, not for any reason. The person took the stone, a little unsure. Kale looked back up at the sky. "When you close your eyes," he said, "does the sky disappear?" The person stayed silent. Kale continued, not explaining, only reminding, as if speaking something already known. The stars don't need us to look at them in order to exist. They don't turn off when we look away. They're just outside our sight. The night wind moved through, carrying the scent of dry grass. Kyle stepped slightly to the side and pointed toward a section of sky where the stars were denser. Some of those stars died a very long time ago, he said, but their light is still reaching us. Not because they're trying to stay, but because the light was already sent. The person tilted their head higher this time, eyes resting there longer. Not because they suddenly understood, but because something inside had begun to slow. Kale did not ask about the one who had gone. He did not need names or stories. He knew that some losses do not need to be retold to be real. They only need a space wide enough that the mind is no longer clenched around them. The two of them stood there a while longer without speaking. Kale walked to the edge of the clearing and straightened his jacket. When he turned back, he noticed the other person was no longer gripping the stone so tightly. Their fingers had loosened on their own, as if there were no longer a need to hold proof. Some people leave our reach, Kale said quietly, but they don't leave our life. They stay in the way you look at the sky, in the things you know now that you didn't know before. The person nodded very slightly. Not agreement, just a sign that the words had found a place to land. Kyle looked up again, as a thin streak of a shooting star crossed the sky. So fast that blinking might make someone doubt it happened at all. Kale didn't point. He didn't name it. He let the moment pass as itself. When the night deepened, Kale turned and began walking back down the hill. The other person followed, without needing direction. The sky remained behind them. No one carried stars in their pockets, yet no one left empty-handed. Some things do not need to be held to be known as present. Far away, very real, in the widest part of the night. Kale walked slowly down the familiar slope, small stones shifting underfoot. The other person followed at a natural distance, neither rushing nor closing the gap. They allowed the night to arrange its own rhythm. The stars gradually disappeared behind the trees, but the darkness did not grow heavier. It only changed shape, as everything in life tends to do. At the bottom of the hill, Kale stopped, turned, and gave a small nod, a farewell that did not require another meeting. The other person paused briefly, then continued on their own path. No thank you was spoken. No goodbye. What needed to be given had already been given, without being held. Kale stood a little longer and looked up at the sky one last time that night. Some stars had faded as his eyes adjusted again to the distant town lights. But he did not mistake that for disappearance. He knew they were still there, doing their work, whether anyone was looking or not. He went inside, closed the door behind him, hung his jacket, washed and dried his hands, and left the light very low. There was no closing ritual, no final thought to complete, just a night arriving at its natural end. Some losses make us believe that something has vanished completely. Buddhism looks more deeply and reminds us that not every departure is total loss. Many things simply leave our field of vision, not the life that continues within us. Stars do not go out when we close our eyes. They do not require our attention to exist. Just as some people are no longer beside us, yet remain present in how we understand life, in who we become after they have passed through our days. We often cling to memory as proof that something mattered. But true memory does not need to be gripped. When we stop being afraid of forgetting, what needs to stay will stay on its own, quietly and steadily, like starlight sent long before we ever looked up. Buddhism does not teach us to hold on or let go by force. It gently reminds us that some things hurt more the tighter we grasp them, and some things only need permission. When we accept that gone does not always mean lost, the heart naturally widens, and the empty space is no longer a wound, but a sky where what matters most is still present, even if it is no longer within reach. After all the stories we've moved through together, perhaps the gentlest thing tonight is not that you've understood something new, but that you no longer need to hold on to anything so tightly. No one in these stories tried to fix the past, and no one attempted to make a departure feel easier than it was. Everything was simply looked at very softly and then placed back where it belongs. Buddhism does not ask us to let go perfectly, nor does it require us to become a different version of ourselves. It only reminds us that everything has its own time to arrive, to stay, and to leave. When we stop calling the past back, not because we force ourselves to forget, but because there is no longer a need. The past naturally moves farther away. From that place, the mind can rest, slowly and honestly. And when there is nothing left to hold, sleep comes on its own, quietly, without needing to be invited. Let your breath cool and clear, like mountain air drifting down a high path. Soften your forehead, your eyes, your jaw. Let your shoulders drop like snow settling on quiet ground. Arms, wrists, fingers, loosening. Chest, belly, opening like cold air, making space inside your lung. Hips, thighs, knees, feet, all falling into deep stillness. Now imagine a soft white glow sliding down the mountainside. Calm, slow, steady. It reaches you, touches your shoulders, your breath, and tells you you can rest now. Let that cool glow quiet the day inside you until your chest feels wide and your mind feels open like a high valley. Let your awareness rise as if carried upward by thin mountain air, past the cliffs, past the quiet peaks, into the wide night sky. Stars like tiny sparks hanging in cool darkness. Everything widening. Everything fading into gentle height. Thank you for closing your day in this calm space. Let sleep come like night falling over the mountains. Soft, slow, certain. And if you want to return to this high quiet again, you can follow the Sleepy Zen channel so we can meet in this wide stillness each night. Sleep well. Sleep well.